Welcome back. This is panel 4, Themes in South Asia. My name is Nick Parent. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Geography at McGill University. I will be chairing this session. So, as with the remainder of this conference, this panel is comprised of 3 presentations. The first presentation will be from Harminder Sran from the University of San Francisco and Navjotpal Kaur from the Memorial University Canada. So whenever you're ready, go for it.
Hello everyone. The title of our presentation is India's Agrarian Crisis, Farmers, Protest and the History of Anthropogenic Environmental Degradation. And I am Harminder. So before we go deeper, let's talk about the geographical context. So in this presentation, we are specifically talking about Punjab, its agriculture, its agrarian crisis, and why its farmers are at the forefront of the farmers' protest in India. Punjab is a North Indian state, and due to its conducive agroclimate location, a vast network of rivers and canals is a perfect location for agriculture, and also the perfect location for carrying out an experiment called the Green Revolution. In the mid-1960s, Norman Borlaug led the way in bringing the new dwarf input-responsive Mexican wheats to India, and the Punjab was the only state in the country that was in a position to take advantage due to its existing agrarian infrastructure. Punjab farmers were provided credit for tractors and other equipment, tubewell connections, and diesel pump sets at their doorsteps. Punjab is known by the name of India's breadbasket because of its highest per acre yield of cereal grains and its maximum contribution to national food pool that is meant to secure the country's reserve food demand. Due to the high produce and productivity of wheat and rice in Punjab, India quickly turned from an importer to an exporter of these grains. However, these dwarf high-yielding varieties were highly input-intensive in terms of fertilizers and pesticides, and the rice crop needed long-standing hours in water for irrigation. Thus started high intensification of agriculture in Punjab, which means using more fertilizers, pesticides, and water in per unit acre of land while growing more than one crop in one growing season. Government of India then started to provide minimum support prices or MSPs to farmers for these cash crops, that is rice, wheat and cotton. With such incentive, farmers further increased acreage under these crops. This increase in acreage was at the expense of decrease in area under traditional crops of pulses, oilseeds and maize. And diversity in agriculture was slowly phased out. Here the figure on left shows the change in acreage under different crops since 1970-71. It shows the steep increase in area under rice cultivation after the Green Revolution from 1970-71 to 1990-91. Here you can see the crop-wise area and the trend of fertilizers consumption in Punjab since 1970-71 that was required for these crops. There was an increase in the area under wheat cultivation, but as wheat had also been a traditional crop and already occupied considerable area under cultivation in Punjab, the increase was not as steep as the rice crops. The second figure on the right side shows a trend of fertilizers consumption, that is in kilogram per hectare in Punjab from 1970 to 71. It shows that nitrogen fertilizers consumption increased by 8.6 times from 175 kilogram per hectare in 1970-71 to 1510 kilogram per hectare in 2015-16. Phosphorus fertilizers consumption increased by 14.5 times from 31 kilogram per hectare in 1970-71 to 452 kilogram per hectare in 2015-16. From these two graphs, we can see that for 2 decades, 1970-71 and 1980-81 of high increase in area under rice production, there was 3 and 1.4 times almost parallel increase in nitrogen consumption per hectare, with a complementary increase of 3 and 1.7 times in rice acreage. Over time, pests grew immune to pesticides and farmers, in desperation, began pumping out more of these chemicals. Their excessive use not only contaminated the air, soil, and the water table, but also exposed plants and humans to the threat of pesticides. In this slide, figure on the left shows the increase in pesticide consumption from 3,200 metric ton in 1980-81 to almost double amount of 5,843 metric ton in 2016-17. Figure on the right side shows the change in cropping intensity in Punjab since 1960-61. In the beginning of Green Revolution, cropping intensity was 126%. That increased to 191% in 2018-19. In this slide, the link between an increase in rice acreage and water deficit in Punjab since rice adoption after the Green Revolution is shown. Figure on the left side shows the increased gap between water demand and supply. The gap started increasing in Punjab since 1970-71, the same period when acreage under rice cultivation started increasing. The graph on the right side is the trend of acreage under different crops since 1970-71 that I discussed in one of my previous slides. If we compare both these graphs, we see a similar steep trend in increase of acreage under rice cultivation and water deficit. The area under rice crop increased by 12.5 folds, whereas the water availability decreased and water deficit increased to 1.67 million hectare meters. The unchecked use of harmful chemicals in agriculture has led to serious environmental and social problems in Punjab. The toxic heavy metals from fertilizers and persistent pesticide residues are leached into the soil, get mixed with groundwater, which is then used for drinking and other purposes. These toxins then find their way into human body and produced significant health risks such as cancer. Punjab is also known as the cancer capital of India. Then birth defects in children and other mental and physical health risks. The consistent pumping of groundwater for irrigation has led the water table to recede to dangerously low levels at which it can no longer be replenished. Because of such practices, the soil has also become alkaline and infertile. Productivity of crops have now fallen and the farmers in enormous amount debts which they are unable to pay, and hence most of them commit suicides. Now coming to the farmers' protest. that has been going on since the last 6 months. Government of India passed these 3 farm bills in the middle of pandemic without consulting the farmers and their participation. I am not going to discuss these in detail here, but will discuss what effects they are going to have for farmers and agriculture. Basically, these farm laws will lead to the start of privatization of agriculture in India. Through these laws, private buyers will be able to buy produce directly from the farmers who presently go to the mandis or open markets to sell their produce, where they can at least get the MSP or the minimum support price, and sometimes higher prices with the help of local middlemen. These laws also aim to phase out those middlemen. Farmers apprehend that these laws will lead to the even more exploitation of their labor, their resources, if private companies come into the scene with their contract farming, and things will like that, and they don't even get the MSP. Further, majority of Indian farmers are small and marginal landowners and already indebted. After these laws are implemented, they won't be able to sustain and will be forced to sell out their land to private corporate operated farms, which will lead to de-peasantization. As I have explained above, farmers and farming in India are already going through a severe crisis, and these laws will just exacerbate it. So the farmers are protesting to save their livelihood, their land, and their lives. This protest is not a reaction to just these 3 laws, but these laws served as an immediate stimulant. Farmers and agriculture have been suffering from the last 5 decades, and it's high time that measures can be taken to shift agriculture towards a more sustainable practice. Farmers don't need a green revolution 2.0 that these laws claim that they will bring. They need government support in saving and reclaiming the environmental resources. There are ways, but an infrastructure needs to be developed to implement those. And thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you very much, Harminder.
You're most welcome.
Okay, so if you can just stop sharing your screen. Great, thank you. Okay, our next speaker is Donal Thomas from State University of New York at Stony Brook. And I've been told that there is no presentation, so let's see if I can, oh, there you are, Donal. Okay, so you can unmute yourself whenever you're ready.
First of all, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Nick, for chairing the session, and thanks Indian Ocean Burial Center for giving the opportunity to present the paper. My paper is entitled "Floods in the Western Ghats: A Natural and Man-Made Catastrophe." Giving the context, in this presentation, I am focusing on 2 floods in Munnar, a hill station in the Western Ghats, currently part of the state of Kerala, India. Studying environmental or extreme weather events and taking 2 distinct movements of the same geography or places will help to know how various population approach to similar incidents and how similar it affected the geography and population. Looking at Munnar, a British hill station and the post-colonial South Asian hill town, trace how 2 distinct historical moments responded to similar events in 2 different temporal socio-political conditions. According to UNESCO, the mountain chain of Western Ghats represents geomorphic features of immense importance with unique biophysical and ecological process. The site's high montane forest ecosystem influenced the Indian monsoon weather pattern. Moderation of the tropical climate of the region, the site presents one of the best examples of monsoon system on the planet. It also has an exceptionally high level of biological diversity and endemism and is recognized as one of the world's 8 hottest hotspots of the biological diversity. Geographically, the Western Ghats extended along the southeast coast of India from River Tapti to the southern tip of India. In this paper, I am focusing on 2 major floods that happened in Munnar. First one in July and August 1924, and the second one that happened recently in August 2018. Munnar, like I will just give a brief context about Munnar also. The landscape of Munnar was transformed by the British advancement in the region and turning the region into a British hill station. The British colonial efforts from the 19th century cleared many forest regions of Munnar and started growing teak trees for international shipbuilding and railways. The British brought the region to the international attention by introducing cash crops to the region. The British introduced coffee, cinchona, and tea to the region, and finally, tea survived. The tea British brought to Munnar resulted in the formation of one of the major company named Kannan Devan Hill Produce Company. The tea plantation famous in Munnar now were thick forest region until 1850s. The tea produced in Munnar was exported, and this through a port known as Tuticorin, now known as Thoothukudi, in current state of Tamil Nadu in India. And this phase of Munnar can be noted as the tea plantation period. The period after this mix of tea plantation, and then is the period after the mix of tea plantation period is the migration period. During this period in Munnar, many Malayali and Tamil migration occurred to the region. The severe famines in the 1940s in the princely state of Travancore made many population to migrate to Munnar and nearby regions. Christians from Travancore migrated and were allowed to clear forest areas for agricultural purposes. 5 acres of forest can be cleared for cultivation, and by 1973, state government introduced a law to support it as a short-term lease. Later, after 2000, this short-term lease was made into a permanent ownership. Even though the migrants got the land, the major share of the land in Munnar and the surrounding areas is still under the Kannan Devan Hill Produce Company. And after 2000, there is a faster development phase in Munnar, especially relating to the tourism industry. Munnar was also a home for various tribal populations. The major tribal population in the region are Mannan, Palayan, Malarayan, Ulladan, and Hilpulaya. The major population boom that occurred in Munnar happened only after the British advancement in the region, and this made the tribal groups lose their living habitat and limit themselves to the inner forest. Most of the tribal groups of the region still live isolation with the society, and even though few of them started working outside the forest after 2000. First of all, the Great Flood of 1924, more like the flood in the colonial times. The flood of 1924 started with the heavy rain on 16th July. Within 2 days, the rain increased beyond expectation, resulting in a flood in the region. The flood affected Munnar, which was a truly British-made hill station and town. The flood destroyed the road connected Munnar with Kochi. The flood turned roads into rivers and rivers to be new land areas. According to the historian Minu Jacob, the severity of the flood can be noted with the increase of water level up to St. Anthony's Chapel in that Munnar town. The water raised almost 5 feet in the town, and the bungalows of the many British officials were affected by the severity of the flood. The flood in general affected all population, and the railway lines, all Munnar tea factories, schools were completely destroyed. The British made railway lines for the easy transportation of various products, including tea and teak, were completely destroyed. And the loss of railway tracks was an immense for the British, as it decreased their productivity relating to the tea plantations. After the flood, the reconstruction activities in Munnar were done by the joint efforts of Madras Presidency and the princely state of Travancore. The British created a new ropeway from Munnar to Bodi for the easy transportation of goods. Later, this ropeway also helped the easy transportation of necessary commodities needed for the local population, including food items. The reconstruction of roads was done immediately after the flood, as the plantation works cannot be done without proper roads, especially inside the estates. So British officials directly supervised the road construction. The flood of 1924 resulted in a major British policy change in Munnar. The British started focusing more on tea in the region as they found it as the most profitable item. Flood severely affected the existing nature of the region's geography, and tea became that produce that gave British high productivity and profit. The Kandanavan Hill Produce Company thus became the only producer of tea. The post-flood efforts of the British in Munnar focused on creating a tea plantation-based economy in the region. Next one I'm talking is about the flood of 2018. That is the flood in the post-colonial Munnar. According to the Global Green Watch, the yearly monsoon lasting from June to September severely affected India in 2018. India was ranked among the top 5 nations across the globe affected by extreme weather events in 2018. The state of Kerala was especially impacted. 324 people died because of drowning and being buried in the landslides set off by the flooding. Over 220,000 people had to leave their homes and 20,000 houses were damaged. The flood casualty in Munnar in 2018 was above 50 and resulted many landslides. Munnar got isolated by the flood of 2018. Heavy rains followed by flood and landslides confined the region for 3 days starting from 15th August. The government rescue teams couldn't act in Munnar in the initial days after the flood as the region lost contact with the other parts of the state. The headquarters of the district or county where Munnar is situated couldn't connect with Munnar due to the lack of connectivity issues. The heavy rain caused landslides in the region and Munnar town was flooded. The locals of the region made initial rescue operations. The efforts were supported by various social workers group, farmers group, religious institutions, youth associations, drivers association, etc. Locals supported initial rescue camps operated from schools and colleges, which later taken over by state governments. In the initial days of flood, people were not aware about the things happening across the region. The loss of communication facilities due to the failure of power supply hindered the connectivity. However, within this limitation, people worked as collective aid groups and helped each other. They used natural resources, including locally available food materials, as essentials from outside Munnar couldn't reach the inner lands due to the destruction of roads and bridges. The series of landslides in Munnar due to floods caused infrastructural damages in the region. There were 12 major landslides in the region, followed by many smaller ones. Many buildings were destroyed, including the Government College Munnar. Many houses collapsed and several others bent to one side, resulting it not fit for living. As landslides seriously affected the region, the major risk was to find safe places for rescue camps. The schools, churches, temples became the rescue camps, as many of them were situated in the top of small hills, not in the valleys, as in this location the possibility of landslides was less and was relatively safe place. Many people, especially the Dalit and daily workers, were the major groups in these rescue camps as they lost their homes or their living surroundings. The roads destroyed due to floods and landslides made the region isolated. I already mentioned that. And many bridges were destroyed, and the rescuers from different parts of the state couldn't reach the region soon after the heavy rain in August. The local inhabitants of the region, along with the local police, Kerala State Electricity Board staff, fire and rescue forces made efforts to clear the trees that fell on the roads and made temporary roads. These initial steps helped for the easy movement of essential commodities in the region. The Munnar town's close proximity to the borders of Tamil Nadu also helped the region to get essential things. Initially, when the Kerala government couldn't send things due to issues related to road connectivity. The initial responders to the flood and landslides in Munnar were unsung heroes of the natural calamity. These unsung heroes are from all sections of the society, including farmers, estate workers, drivers, youth, and I already mentioned some of the groups previously. Many of them collectively participated helping the people affected by the natural calamity. For example, the drivers are the ones who help to circulate necessary things and connect the different areas of Munnar with the help of their own vehicles. They worked without any expectation, and their willingness to drive through destroyed roads helped save many lives due to the landslides. Many farmers contributed their food products freely to the rescue camps and also to different people affected by floods. Youth were the active groups who effectively participated in the rescue operations and saved many people stuck in the isolated regions of the hills even before the NDRF team, National Disaster Response Force team, or trained rescuers came. The flood of 2018 also affected the various tribal population. The question of the tribal population response and adaptation to the floods are not clearly documented. So it's hard to locate how much severe the flood affected the tribal population in the region. To conclude, floods as a natural phenomena causes serious alteration to the existing nature of the environment, and the change that occurs after flood severely affected every section of the society. The flood changed the natural flow of few rivers and destroyed roads and basic infrastructures in the region of Munnar, which was also followed by heavy landslides, resulting in large environmental damage to the region. The flood in both situations, that is in 1924 and 2018, affected every strata of the society. The British officials got exposed to the floods in the same way coolies or the local servants of the estates were. The coolies of the working class became more vulnerable as they lived in small housing units, which was not similar to the large bungalows where the British officials lived. In 1924, Munnar was under colonial rule, and the natives of the region did not have adequate voices in the flood responses and adaptation. Whereas in 2018 floods, the post-colonial democratic government and the native inhabitants were the first responders. After the flood, the British tried their efforts to reconstruct the entire Munnar town and nearby region for their monetary benefits, as the tea plantation in Munnar were highly profitable. In 2018, the Munnar still had large tea plantation, and the new addition to the region was the tourism industry, as I already mentioned. The flood of 2018 happened during the beginning of a busy tourist season starting from August. So their governmental efforts after the flood aimed at the upliftment of tourism industry along with the local and marginalized people and also the plantations. Memories also play an important role in remembering floods and recording historical events. The flood was a memory for the people of Munnar before 2018 and conceived to the present generations through oral sources or history. Soon after the flood of 2018, the situation changed and the memories became reality. Even now, all the generations in Munnar remember many events in the past relating to the 1924 floods. They use flood as historical time marker to remember various events. The 2018 flood is also a memory for the current generation, which may or will pass to the future generation as a historical marker. So flood can be a historical time marker like any other political event. And in my final paragraph, Munnar fought against the crisis of flood as a collective group overcoming social hierarchies. Among the various groups involved in the rescue operation, only very few were identified, and many still remain as unsung heroes. Many considered helping flood-affected people in the area as their duty and did not even reveal themselves, as most of them, and even now, most of them remain still behind the screen. Munnar also faced a flood in August 2019, and the same unsung heroes came up and supported many and left behind without any traces. So while mentioning about flood, it is quite awkward not to mention about the unsung heroes. Us, they are still living around us and will be always there as a hope for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donal. That was very interesting. Interesting cross-temporal look at things and seeing how relief is sort of directed and prioritized differently under different sort of political conditions. Okay, our final presentation will be given by Boris Wille at the Martin Luther University Halle-Wittenberg in Germany. So whenever you're ready, go for it.
Yeah, am I audible? Can you see my screen? Yes. Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me in this conference. It's very exciting for me to be in Canada today. In this presentation, I discuss atoll engineering activities in the Maldivian archipelago over the last 6 decades. Just to clarify straight away, I use the notion of atoll engineering as a shorthand term to capture geoengineering activities that encompass the construction of terrestrial, littoral, and submarine areas in coral island ecosystems. My discussion pursues 2 aims. First, it demonstrates how atoll engineering projects reflect preoccupations of Maldivian society. And second, it shows how such projects display altered relationships to and engagements with the archipelagic environment. Hence, in view of the conference theme, I offer a reading of atoll engineering as an arena in which human environment entanglements are acted out, shaped, and negotiated. Evidently, geoengineering is an ancient activity in the Indian Ocean region, in the sense that coastlines have been transformed, harbors have been built, dams and breakwaters have been constructed, shipping lanes and channels have been dredged, and marine obstacles have been marked for centuries or even millennia. However, the scale, scope, and speed with which geoengineering occurs in the Indian Ocean region today is unprecedented in history. Just think of the spectacular artificial island constructions in the Emirates or the grand infrastructure projects conducted as part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. In the Maldives, this intensification is also observable. In the last decade alone, the number of Maldivian islands that display artificial modification has increased by more than 50%, which means that by now more than 70% of the about 400 exploited islands show signs of geoengineering. Granted, it is not clear at which historical point one may actually speak of human manipulation of Earth surfaces in terms of engineering. Nevertheless, for working purposes, one may say that any geoengineering involves the purposeful construction of Earth surfaces to meet the needs of humans. These needs cover a wide spectrum and may include issues such as protection from environmental hazards, exploitation of resources, improvement of communications, or considerations of environmental aesthetics. The minimal characterization of geoengineering, or atoll engineering for that matter, as the purposeful construction of Earth surfaces already marks it as a socio-cultural endeavor. This is because it brings together various forms of knowledge about environments, skills and craftsmanship to transform these very environments, as well as technologies, resources, regulations, and labor that are required to achieve these transformations. The impetuses with which environments are transformed, in turn, reveal what is at stake for a given society at a given point in time, and hence geoengineering activities offer a glimpse into the very fabric of societies and their changing imperatives and preoccupations. To illustrate this, let me briefly discuss 4 issues apparent in atoll engineering activities in the Maldives. Hang on. The first is connectivity. Many atoll engineering projects in the Maldives today aim at improving maritime transport facilities. This is among the oldest concerns in the island nation. Although there's hardly any archaeology and historiography on this topic in the Maldives, in the first large-scale coastal engineering project I was able to find mention of is the harbor construction in the capital island Male in 1837. The Sultan had instructed the island chiefs of the off-islands to craft small boats to send to Male. These vessels sailed to the capital and their crews were catered for and waged by local big men, about which I've written elsewhere. The men from the outer islands were assigned to dredge the harbor basin and to break holes that would be used in the construction of the breakwaters on the lagoon side of the island. This is depicted here at the top of this 1922 map, and which can also be seen in the next image, probably dating from 1912. This already illustrates that atoll engineering is an affair that encompasses wide sections of society. At least since then, the facilitation of seaborne travel through the construction of shipping lanes, harbors, and breakwaters has remained an atoll engineering priority in the Maldives. This was, however, supplemented by a new kind of activity in the 1960s, namely the reclamation of land. The first large-scale land reclamation project was the extension of Male's neighboring island, Wille. For the construction of an airplane landing strip, the island was expanded onto the surrounding reef flat. Interestingly, the change in the means of connectivity from sea to air travel reflected in changing imperatives in atoll engineering. Whereas the facilitation of connectivity by sea chiefly involved the reworking of aquatic spaces, airborne connectivity now required the creation of terrestrial air. The construction of the international airport occurred at a time of widespread changes in the Maldives. The archipelago had become independent in 1965, had established a republic 3 years later, and saw the arrival of tourism in 1972. Like elsewhere, the imperative of the young post-colonial state was on development and modernization. This second issue, development and modernization, also reflects in Maldivian atoll engineering projects. Based on experiences gained from the airport project, Male was next to being extended. The southern fringe of the capital was pushed onto the island's house reef, which in effect created an entirely new suburb. This new space was designed to house facilities associated with a modern lifestyle, like an Olympic sports ground, higher education facilities, a power plant, a petrol station, a barracks, a hospital, a park, and an exhibition venue. In 1987, however, there was a backlash to the ambitious reclamation project because Male was hit by a storm surge. This not only devastated the capital, but also washed away a significant portion of the freshly reclaimed land. This event had a profound effect on the atoll engineering strategy because it altered Maldivians dealing with environmental hazards like erosion and flooding. Whereas historically, Maldivians used to migrate and rebuild entire settlements when environmental conditions became unfavorable, they now aimed at securing the existence in place. The solidification of land masses by means of coastal defense structures became the favored approach. Note the concrete walls and tetrapods depicted in the bottom right image here. The defiance of environmental influences is especially palpable in the thus far largest atoll engineering project in the Maldives, Male. Since 1997, the entire reef flat of the Faroukulu-Fushi Lagoon has been reclaimed to realize an urban utopia, branded as, and I quote, the city of hope that is economically and environmentally resilient through the application of green architecture, end of quote. Male is framed, and I quote again, as the beacon of development for the Maldives, end of quote. Male is projected to accommodate 240,000 residents, making it by far the largest settlement in the archipelago. As part of the construction plan, the island was not only particularly solidified, note the cement blocks here at the beach, but it was also leveled 2 meters above sea level, which is double the Maldivian average. This design is meant to secure the island against storm tides and sea level rise. In this sense, Male as a whole is the flagship project for 2 reasons. On the one hand, it displays the Maldives' efforts in hazard mitigation by means of solidification. And on the other hand, it shows that the construction of artificial islands paves the way to Maldivian modernization and development. If we leave the capital region and attend to rural islands, coastal safeguarding and land reclamation appears not as neat and sophisticated in terms of design and workmanship. This is because solid construction materials are a scarce and valuable resource in an environment lacking rocks, gravel, cement, and even the right type of sand. On the majority of rural islands that I visited, beaches were nourished with whatever was available, garbage or debris, as depicted in this image and the next. These two examples illustrate that atoll engineering needs not necessarily be planned and carried out professionally, but may also result from a population's disposal behavior, since after all, even dump sites shift the boundary between land and sea. In contrast to the rural islands of the local population, resort islands display atoll engineering that is much more informed by environmental aesthetics and attuned to tourist demands. Consider the breakwater in this image. Of course, it fulfills the technical purpose of securing the beach, but at the same time, it is designed in an appealing, visually non-obstructive fashion. This brings me to the next issue apparent in atoll engineering that is particularly visible in tourist resorts, the staging of nature. Many resorts craft their surroundings to meet tourist expectations. This involves, for instance, the creation of tropical beaches. As shown in the image here, resorts more or less continuously pump up sand from nearby lagoons to craft the white, spotless, sandy palm beaches tourists came to consume. Besides beaches, the other main tourist attraction are the coral reefs and marine life. Over the years, resorts have developed various ways to facilitate and ease the visual consumption of submarine environments. One interesting example is the snorkeling channel depicted here. It displays the somewhat paradoxical engagements of resorts with their immediate marine environments. In order to protect the reef from damage caused by snorkelers, the reef was destroyed to a certain degree by dredging a submarine pathway into the reef flat. Another trend in the last 2 decades or so has been that resorts have started to farm and plant corals in order to create reefs. Initially, such coral cultivation initiatives were a reaction to the repeated coral bleaching events that started in the 1990s and that had particularly affected the reef-building stony coral species. Yet once resorts realized the potential that entire submarine landscapes could be crafted, they began to manufacture reef structures that are even easier to consume for tourists. Consider the underwater restaurant depicted in this image and the submarine cabin in the next. For the construction of such submarine facilities, the original reefs were destroyed, and once the glass domes were set up, artificial reefs were put in place. The idea is that such inverted fish tanks allure tourists to spend even more for being able to gaze at submarine life without having to immerse themselves in the ocean. The construction of such submarine structures is of course highly invasive to natural reef environments, a fact resorts conceal by carefully crafting natural appealing reefs which are entirely engineered. So although resorts have spearheaded coral farming as environmental entrepreneurs, they are nevertheless not entrepreneurial environmentalists, since their atoll engineering activities primarily aim at commodifying nature. So my rendering of the Maldives atoll engineering activities may evoke the sense that one engineering preoccupation was succeeded by another. This is clearly not the case. Instead, my observation is that atoll engineering was diversified and broadened in scope and scale. Today, atoll engineering appears as the omnipotent tool to tackle a wide range of problems, issues, and aspirations. So the beginnings of particular atoll engineering activities may more or less actually be marked in time. And as I try to illustrate in this figure, no activity has been discontinued in favor of another, but instead more kinds of activities have been added to the portfolio of atoll engineering. The improvement of seaborne connectivity that may have started even before 1837 continues to be of utmost importance, since harbor construction is a priority in local island development schemes today. The same may be said for the improvement of airborne connectivity that began in the 1960s in the capital. Meanwhile, 14 more landing strips have been built across the Maldives. Land reclamation and solidification of coasts that began in the 1980s has by now been applied to about 300 islands. The creation of entirely new artificial islands is particularly fashionable in the tourism industry at present. And the curation of littoral and submarine landscapes that began in the 1990s, the latest, has now spread to residential islands with the introduction of guest house tourism in the 2010s. So the column on the right of this chart indicates the proliferation of atoll engineering activities at the contemporary moment. Let me conclude. Atoll engineering is a multifaceted arena of human-environment engagements in which social, political, economic, technical, and cultural aspects are entangled. The proliferation of atoll engineering activities in the Maldives is indication of the apparent belief that the fixing of problems, the tackling of challenges, and the realization of visions are indeed matters to which engineering provides solutions. Consequently, at least in the Maldivian case, geoengineering has evolved to an activity that affects increasingly more spheres of life. The examples I discussed here at once attest and manifest the hopes, desires, fears, and worries of Maldivian society. Thank you.